The gavel came down so hard it cracked the edge of the judge's desk, and the sound rang through the Sweetwater County Courthouse like a gunshot on a Sunday morning. Wilhelmina Ellsworth stood at the center of that room with her spine straight as a fence post and her hands trembling at her sides, though she refused to let a single soul in that crowded gallery see the fear pooling behind her dark brown eyes. The smell of sawdust and pipe tobacco and sweated wool filled the small chamber. Every bench was packed. Every face was turned toward her. And at the far end of the room, leaning against the paneled wall with his arms crossed over a chest that seemed built to resist the whole of the American frontier, stood Raymond Finley. He was not a man who needed to raise his voice to command a room. He was tall and broad-shouldered, with sun-darkened skin, and a jaw set in the kind of quiet certainty that came not from arrogance, but from a man who had survived enough to stop doubting himself. His dark eyes were fixed on Wilhelmina with an expression she could not yet read, though it made the air in her lungs feel suddenly thin. The judge, a weathered man named Horace Prentice, who had presided over Sweetwater County disputes for 20 years, cleared his throat above the murmuring crowd. He adjusted his spectacles and looked down at the paper before him. "The debt of $1,240, Judge Prentice read aloud, held against the estate of the late Clyde Ellsworth, has been legally transferred by deed of obligation to the account of his daughter, Miss Wilhelmina Ellsworth, who is the sole surviving heir and named executor of said estate." A ripple moved through the gallery. Wilhelmina felt it like a cold wave against her back. "Furthermore," the judge continued, "the creditor of record, Mr. Raymond Finley of the Broken Spur Ranch, has submitted a formal petition of contractual claim, which this court finds to be lawfully binding under the statutes of the territory of New Mexico, year of our Lord 1883. He set the paper down. He looked over his spectacles at Wilhelmina, and she thought she saw something almost apologetic in his ancient eyes. Raymond Finley unfolded himself from the wall and stepped forward through the gallery's low wooden gate. He was unhurried. He had the gait of a man who had never needed to rush because the land had always waited for him. Someone in the gallery called out, "What's the claim, Finley? What do you want with the girl?" Raymond stopped. He turned his head slowly toward the voice, and the man who had spoken apparently found a sudden interest in his own boots. Then Raymond looked at Wilhelmina, and his voice came out measured and unmistakably clear in the silence of that courthouse. "She answers to no one but me." The gallery erupted. Wilhelmina felt her face flush from her collar to her hairline. Her fingers curled into fists at her sides. She turned to face him fully, every molecule of her being focused into the sharpest kind of fury, and she took one step toward Raymond Finley and said, in a voice that carried just as far as his had, "I beg your pardon." He held her gaze and said nothing more. And in that moment, with the gavel cracking again for order and the crowd pressing forward and the summer heat of 1883 pressing down on the territory of New Mexico like an iron flat, Wilhelmina Ellsworth understood that her life was about to change in every direction at once. She had not always been afraid of Raymond Finley. In fact, there had been a time, not so long ago, when she had thought him the most dangerous kind of man precisely because he made her feel so completely unafraid. It had started 4 months earlier, in the sharp, bright days of March, when the desert still held morning cold, and the scrub grass was just beginning to return its color to the hills surrounding the town of Sweetwater, New Mexico territory. Wilhelmina had arrived in Sweetwater on the southbound stage from Santa Fe, carrying 2 trunks, a leather satchel, and the freshly devastating news of her father's death. She was 26 years old. She had been living in Santa Fe for 3 years working as a schoolteacher, which had suited her just fine because it gave her independence and a small salary, and a reason to be far from the Ellsworth homestead, which had always felt like a place built from her father's broken promises. Clyde Ellsworth had been a rancher in the loosest possible definition of the word. He owned land. He owned cattle, though never quite the number he claimed. He had a gift for talking men into extended credit and a corresponding inability to pay it back. He drank too much in the latter part of his life, not viciously but steadily, like a man draining a reservoir one cup at a time. Wilhelmina had loved him in the complicated way a daughter loves a father who disappoints her repeatedly but means well every single time. When the letter reached her in Santa Fe, she had read it 3 times. Clyde Ellsworth was dead of a heart attack. The Ellsworth homestead, a modest 160 acres on the eastern edge of Sweetwater County, was hers by inheritance. And there were debts. There had always been debts. She had not known the exact scope of them when she boarded that stage. She had simply known she had to go home, close out whatever remained of her father's affairs, sell the land if necessary, and return to her life in Santa Fe, where things made a reliable kind of sense. Sweetwater was not what she remembered. It had grown in the years she had been away, not dramatically, but the way a creek grows after a good season. The main street had a new hotel called the Meridian, a telegraph office, and a dry goods store that had expanded its storefront by half again. The population had pushed past 400. There was a marshal's office now, which there had not been when she was a girl. She had gone directly to the law office of a man named Josiah Crane, who handled most of Sweetwater's legal paperwork and served as the county clerk. Josiah was a small, precise man who wore wire-rimmed glasses and kept his records in a state of terrifying organization. He had delivered the news about the debts the way a doctor delivers a terminal diagnosis, calmly and without embellishment. The total outstanding against the Ellsworth estate was $1,240. The largest single portion of it, $800, was owed to Raymond Finley of the Broken Spur Ranch. Raymond Finley, Wilhelmina had repeated. He loaned your father that money 3 years ago, Josiah said, not looking up from his ledger. The terms were documented, signed by both parties and filed with the county court. Your father made 2 partial payments in the first year and nothing since. What is the security on the loan? Josiah had looked up then. The land, Miss Ellsworth. She had sat with that for a long moment in Josiah's small, dusty office with the afternoon light coming through the single window and laying a band of gold across the floorboards. $800 of a $1,200 debt, secured by the only tangible thing her father had left her. Without the land, the remaining $400 in smaller debts would still leave her with nothing. I need to speak with Raymond Finley, she had said. I wouldn't recommend it today, Josiah replied. He's driving cattle down from the northern pasture this week. Give him till Saturday. She had given him till Saturday. The Broken Spur Ranch sat 6 miles west of Sweetwater proper, and it was nothing like the Ellsworth homestead. Where her father's land had the look of a place perpetually behind its own maintenance, the Broken Spur was ordered and serious and alive with the particular energy of a working enterprise. The main house was not grand, but it was solid, built from dark timber with a wide covered porch that faced east toward the morning light. The barn and outbuildings were well kept. The fencing was tight and even. There were horses in the corral that moved with the kind of ease that spoke to good handling and better feed. Wilhelmina had driven herself out in a rented buckboard, which had garnered exactly the kind of sidelong glances from Sweetwater's residents that she had expected and ignored. A woman driving herself to a cattle ranch to conduct business was not entirely unheard of in New Mexico territory in 1883, but it was still the sort of thing people noticed. She had found Raymond Finley at the edge of his eastern pasture, mending a section of fence with a hired hand named Dolph. He was exactly as she had imagined him from Josiah's description of a man who loaned $800 with enough confidence to put it in writing. He was perhaps 32 or 33, lean with the kind of strength that came from daily work rather than display, and he had not smiled when she introduced herself, but he had listened to every word she said with a focused attention that she found both respectful and unsettling. "You've come about your father's debt," he said when she finished. "I have." He had looked at her for a moment, then at the fence he'd been mending, then back at her. "Ride with me," he said. It was not a question exactly, but it was not quite a command either. It sat somewhere in the borderland between the two, and Wilhelmina, who did not particularly enjoy borderlands of any kind, had climbed back onto the buckboard and followed him along the fence line while he walked his horse slowly and she kept pace. He had asked her about her plans, about Santa Fe, about the state of the homestead. He had not been brusque or dismissive. He had listened to her answers as though they mattered. And somewhere in that strange, unhurried conversation along the edge of his pasture, with the March wind coming down off the mountains and the scrub grass nodding in it, Wilhelmina had felt something shift in the atmosphere between them, something she had no name for yet and was not ready to examine. She had proposed a payment arrangement. She would liquidate the smaller debts first, sell off the remaining cattle on the homestead, which were only 11 head and aging, and then use the proceeds plus her own small savings to begin making payments on the primary note. She needed 18 months. Raymond had said he would consider it and send word to Josiah Crane. That had been the first meeting. The second had happened by accident 2 weeks later at the Sweetwater General Store, where Wilhelmina had gone for provisions and found Raymond at the counter discussing a freight order with the proprietor. He had tipped his hat. She had nodded. And then, because the proprietor had gone to the back to locate a particular item and left them standing in the same aisle, they had talked. Not about the debt. About books of all things, because Wilhelmina had a volume of Marcus Aurelius tucked under her arm and Raymond had apparently read it. He had quoted a passage to her from memory, something about the quality of a man being measured not by what he pursued but by what he endured, and Wilhelmina had found herself arguing that Aurelius had a blind spot about the endurance of women, and Raymond had gone very still and then said, with a slight curve at the corner of his mouth, "I think you might be right about that." That had been the beginning of the trouble if Wilhelmina was being honest with herself. Not the debt, not the courthouse. The beginning of the trouble was a Roman emperor quoted incorrectly in a dry goods store in New Mexico territory, by a man with mud on his boots and intelligence in his eyes. The weeks that followed had been a kind of hidden negotiation that neither of them acknowledged openly. Wilhelmina worked the homestead, which was harder than she had anticipated. The house needed repair she was not qualified to make. The remaining cattle needed a buyer, and buyers in Sweetwater in the spring of 1883 were not plentiful because a hard winter had reduced everyone's liquidity. She sold the cattle eventually, at a price lower than she'd hoped, and sent the first payment on the smaller debts. She did not hear from Raymond about the primary note. She heard about Raymond in other ways. Sweetwater, like every small town on the frontier, ran on information, and information moved faster than horses through the social channels of a place with 400 residents. She heard that he was a fair employer and that his cowhands stayed with him for years, which was unusual. She heard that he had bought the broken spur 6 years ago from a man named Cartwright who had gone broke trying to overexpand, and that he had built it methodically and quietly into one of the most productive cattle operations in the county. She heard that he had been briefly engaged to a woman from Las Cruces who had ended it, though no one seemed to know why. She heard that he was private in the way that some men in the territory were private, not from secrets exactly, but from a self-sufficiency that had been earned rather than chosen. She had not gone looking for this information. It had simply arrived, as frontier information did, through the general store and the hotel dining room and the brief exchanges at the post office. And then in April, 3 things happened that changed everything. The first was that her neighbor to the south, a man named Abe Garfield who ran a small but honest operation on 40 acres, told her that a man named Cornelius Hatch had been asking around about the Ellsworth property. Cornelius Hatch was a land speculator who had spent the past 2 years quietly accumulating parcels in Sweetwater County. He was not violent or overtly corrupt, but he operated with the kind of relentless, legally precise pressure that was harder to fight than open confrontation because it left no obvious wound. Abe Garfield said Hatch had been asking Josiah Crane about the status of the Ellsworth debt. He had been asking whether the note held by Finley was currently in default. It was, technically. Wilhelmina had made no payment on the primary note. She had barely begun to address the smaller ones. The second thing that happened was that she received a visit from Hatch himself, a compact, well-dressed man with smooth hands and careful eyes who came to the homestead on a Tuesday morning in a very clean buggy and offered her $400 for the land, which was approximately a third of its actual value, and spoke to her in the tone of a man who is offering charity rather than conducting commerce. She had told him with considerable precision where he could take his $400 and put them. He had smiled the smile of a man who expected to be told no the first time and departed without visible offense. The third thing was that she had gone to the Broken Spur to tell Raymond about Hatch. She had not entirely understood her own reason for going. He was her creditor, not her ally. The debt between them was a source of tension, not trust. But she had driven out on a Wednesday afternoon with her hands tight on the reins and the dust rising behind the buckboard, and Raymond had been on the porch when she arrived, reading, which she had not expected, and he had set the book down and watched her climb down from the buckboard with the expression of a man who recognized urgency when it pulled into his yard. She told him about Hatch. She told him Hatch was inquiring about the default status of the primary note, and that she believed Hatch intended to purchase the note from Raymond if Raymond would sell it, and then use the note's default status to pursue legal foreclosure on the homestead. Raymond had listened to all of it without interrupting. Then he had said, "Come inside." She had followed him into the main house, which was neat and spare and smelled of wood polish and coffee, and he had poured her a cup from the pot on the kitchen stove and set it before her at the table and then sat down across from her. "I have no intention of selling that note to Hatch," he said. "Why not?" She asked because it was the honest question. You get paid immediately and rid yourself of an uncertain debt. Because what Hatch intends to do with it is wrong, Raymond said simply. She looked at him across the table, and there was something in his expression that was entirely unguarded in that moment, a directness that had nothing performative about it, and Wilhelmina felt the shift again, the one she had felt the first time along the fence line, except this time it was stronger and she was close enough to it to recognize what it was. She was in danger of trusting this man. "You should know," Raymond said, "that I don't want your land, Miss Ellsworth. I made the loan to your father because he needed it and I had it and the land was reasonable security. That is the beginning and end of my interest in the property." "Then what is your interest in the debt?" she asked. He looked at her for a long moment and said, "Right now, my interest is in making sure Cornelius Hatch doesn't get it." They had talked for 2 hours that afternoon, about Hatch's methods, about the other parcels Hatch had absorbed, about the legal standing of the note and Wilhelmina's options. Raymond was not a lawyer, but he had the kind of practical intelligence that frontier life developed in some men, the ability to understand systems and their leverage points. He thought Hatch would move to purchase the note formally, through the courts if necessary, if he could establish that the note had been dormant and the creditor was willing to sell. "The simplest protection," Raymond said, "is activity on the account. Any payment, any documented communication between us about the debt establishes that the note is active and that the creditor is engaged." "I can make a payment," Wilhelmina said. $20, he said, "documented through Josiah. That creates a record that we are working in good faith." She had made the $20 payment the following morning. Josiah Crane had recorded it with his usual precision, and Wilhelmina had felt the first faint release of pressure she had felt since arriving in Sweetwater. But Hatch was not easily discouraged. Over the next 6 weeks, he had appeared at the homestead twice more, each time with a slightly higher offer and the same careful, patient smile. He had also, as Wilhelmina learned through Abe Garfield and the reliable channels of town information, approached 3 of the smaller creditors and purchased their notes outright. That meant Hatch now held $300 of her total debt, and while that was not the primary note, it gave him legal standing to appear as a creditor in any court proceeding. The hidden motive behind Hatch's interest was not purely financial, as Wilhelmina came to understand it. The Ellsworth land sat at a particular angle to the drainage patterns of Sweetwater County's eastern basin, and there was a growing theory among the territory's more forward-thinking men that the railroad line being discussed in Santa Fe would eventually push through the county and would require a route that almost certainly crossed a parcel like the Ellsworth homestead. Land that seemed marginally valuable in 1883 would be worth many times that if the railroad came through. Hatch knew this. Wilhelmina, once she understood it, felt the full weight of it. Her father's modest, struggled-over, debt-ridden 160 acres was potentially sitting on a fortune she had not known existed, and Cornelius Hatch had been maneuvering toward it with the unhurried precision of a chess player who has counted all the pieces. The dark past of the debt, the layers of her father's financial failures that had seemed only sad and personal, now revealed themselves as the mechanism of a trap she had not chosen, but had nonetheless walked into. She had gone to Raymond with this information too, not because she had decided to trust him, she told herself, but because he was her primary creditor and anything affecting the status of the debt affected him as well. He had been sitting on his porch in the early evening when she arrived, his hat off and his dark hair still damp from washing, and he had looked up at her from the porch steps with an expression that made something complicate itself quietly in her chest. "You keep coming to tell me things," he said. "You keep being the most useful person to tell them to," she replied. "Sit down," he said, and moved over on the step. She sat down beside him on the porch step of the Broken Spur Ranch in the last light of a May evening, close enough that she could feel the warmth of him through the air between them, and she told him what she had learned about the railroad. He was quiet for a long time after. "That changes things," he said at last. "Does it change them for you as well?" she asked carefully, because she needed to know. She needed to know if the man sitting beside her in the evening quiet was another version of Cornelius Hatch, better mannered and more patient, but ultimately oriented toward the same end. He turned and looked at her directly, and she held his gaze without flinching. "It changes the stakes," he said. "It doesn't change what I said before. I have no interest in your land, Wilhelmina." It was the first time he had used her first name. She had not told him to. It simply arrived in his voice like something that had always been true, and she felt it land in her chest with the particular weight of the word forbidden applied to everything she had been carefully not feeling for the past 2 months. She stood up abruptly and said she needed to get back before dark. He stood too and said he would send a message to Josiah Crane in the morning. She drove home in the gathering dark with her heart conducting itself very poorly. The crisis came in June. Cornelius Hatch had filed a formal petition with the county court, requesting a review of all outstanding debt obligations against the Ellsworth estate on the grounds that the debt had been insufficiently serviced and that the estate was in ongoing default. This was technically true, as Wilhelmina's single $20 payment had been followed by another $30 payment in May, but had not come close to addressing the total. Hatch, as holder of $300 in smaller notes, had legal standing to file the petition, and his attorney was a man named Dawson who was considerably sharper than Josiah Crane and knew his way around the territorial court system. Josiah had sent word to Wilhelmina, and Wilhelmina had come to Sweetwater in a state of controlled panic that she expressed as an extremely set jaw and very fast walking. Josiah told her the court date was set for the 3rd week of July. At the hearing, the judge would review the total debt situation and determine whether the creditors had grounds to pursue foreclosure on the secured property, meaning the land. "What about Finley's note?" Wilhelmina asked. "Finley's note is the question everyone is dancing around," Josiah said. If Finley appears as an active creditor in good standing and testifies that the note is being serviced adequately in his estimation, it significantly complicates Hatch's petition. Hatch can't easily push for foreclosure on the primary security when the primary creditor says he's satisfied. And if Finley doesn't appear, Josiah looked at his desk. Then Hatch's attorney will argue that the primary creditor has effectively abandoned the note, and that the estate's assets should be liquidated to clear the total outstanding debt. Wilhelmina had gone to the Broken Spur that same afternoon, and she had not been measured or careful about it. She had tied the buckboard at the post and gone up the porch steps and knocked on the door, and when Raymond opened it she had said without preamble, "I need to know where you stand." He had looked at her for a moment, reading something in her face, and then stepped back to let her in. She had explained the court petition. She had explained Josiah's analysis. She had told him plainly that if he appeared at the hearing and represented the primary note as active and adequately serviced, Hatch's petition would lose most of its foundation. And she had told him, because she was 26 years old and had not survived her father's world by being naive, that she understood this was asking him to take a position in a legal proceeding that would do him no obvious benefit and might create an adversarial relationship with a man like Cornelius Hatch, who did not forget his obstacles. Raymond had listened to all of it. Then he had said, "What are you afraid I'll say?" She had looked at him and felt the full exposure of the question. What was she afraid of? That he would say yes because it served some hidden motive she hadn't discovered yet. That he would say no because he had finally grown tired of a complicated debt attached to a woman who showed up at his ranch every 2 weeks with another problem. That he would say something in between that would leave the situation as unresolved and precarious as it currently was. "I'm afraid you'll say yes for the wrong reasons," she said, "or no for the right ones." He had gone very still in the way she had come to recognize as his form of the sharpest attention. Then he had taken a step toward her and said, "Wilhelmina, look at me." She looked at him. "I am going to appear at that court hearing," he said. "Not because it's strategically useful, not because I have a hidden interest in your land, and not because I'm afraid of Cornelius Hatch. I'm going to appear because what Hatch is doing is wrong, and because I am the primary creditor and my representation of this debt is accurate when I say it is being serviced in good faith." He paused. "And because I have no intention of allowing someone to take something from you through legal maneuvering that you've been working this hard to protect." The last sentence arrived differently than the others. It was quieter. It sat in the air of his kitchen with a weight that was not about law or land at all. Wilhelmina stood very still and felt the full dangerous reality of what had been building between them for 4 months. She was in considerable trouble, not the legal kind, the other kind, the kind that lived under the sternum and made rational thinking substantially more difficult. "Raymond," she said. "Don't say it yet," he said quietly. "Let's get through the courthouse first." She had driven home that evening in a state of feeling too many things simultaneously to categorize any of them, which was not a state she was accustomed to and did not particularly enjoy and could not seem to stop. The 2 weeks before the court date were the longest of her recent memory. She worked the homestead. She made small repairs that she could manage herself and hired Abe Garfield's boy for the ones she couldn't. She wrote letters to her former school superintendent in Santa Fe, explaining that her return would be delayed. She did not go to the Broken Spur Ranch, because she needed to think clearly, and the Broken Spur had recently become incompatible with clear thinking. She thought instead about the forced choice in front of her. If the hearing went badly, if Hatch's attorney managed to argue successfully for liquidation, she would lose the land, lose whatever future value it held, and return to Santa Fe with nothing but a teacher's salary and the knowledge that she had tried. That was survivable. She had survived things before. She was not the kind of woman who defined herself by what she owned, but there was something about this land that she had not expected to feel when she arrived in Sweetwater in March with 2 trunks and no particular attachment to her inheritance. She had been here 3 months now. She had mended fences, literally, the way her father never quite had. She had cleared brush from the south drainage and discovered that the soil in the eastern quarter was better than anyone seemed to have known, because her father had never planted it. She had watched the light come over the mountains at 5 in the morning and stood in the quiet of the land and felt something that was not quite her father's dream, but was perhaps the beginning of her own. She did not want to lose it. She arrived at the Sweetwater County Courthouse on the 3rd Tuesday of July in her best dress, which was a deep blue wool that she had brought from Santa Fe, and which was not particularly suited to the summer heat, but conveyed the kind of serious intentionality she felt the occasion required. She arrived early enough to speak briefly with Josiah before the gallery filled. The gallery filled quickly. This was, by Sweetwater standards, a significant event. Cornelius Hatch was present with his attorney Dawson, both of them composed and appropriately dressed. Hatch's expression was the one he always wore, patient and slightly charitable, as though he was already sorry it had come to this. Raymond arrived 5 minutes before the session opened, came through the main doors without hurry, and crossed to the far wall of the gallery. He did not look at Wilhelmina immediately. When he did, finally, it was a single direct look that said everything it needed to say and nothing extra, and she held it and felt steadier than she had in weeks. Judge Horace Prentice opened the session. Dawson presented Hatch's petition with the efficiency of a man who had done this before. The numbers were accurate. The default was documented. The petition was legally coherent. Josiah presented Wilhelmina's counterposition, with somewhat less efficiency but equal accuracy. The payments made, the documented correspondence, the good faith effort of the estate's heir. Then Judge Prentice had turned his attention to the question of the primary note and called Raymond Finley to address the court. And Raymond had stepped forward, and he had told the court that the note was active, that payments had been made, that he was satisfied with the progress of repayment, and that he had no interest in foreclosure proceedings. Dawson had challenged this. He had argued that the payments represented less than 5% of the outstanding principal, and that satisfaction with such minimal servicing was not a reasonable creditor position. And Raymond had said, without raising his voice, "The terms of repayment are between myself and Miss Ellsworth, and they are adequate. The note is not in default by the terms we have established." Dawson had pressed. Prentice had allowed it. The argument had gone back and forth for 20 minutes that felt to Wilhelmina like considerably longer, and then the gavel had come down, and Prentice had said he was taking a brief recess to review the documentation. When Prentice returned, he had announced his findings with the deliberate precision of a man who wanted his words recorded accurately. Hatch's petition for a formal debt review was partially granted in the sense that the total debt situation would be formally documented and monitored. However, the petition for immediate foreclosure proceedings on the primary security was denied, as the primary creditor had testified to an active and adequately serviced note. And then Prentice had turned to the question of the estate's ongoing management and made a formal notation in the court record that, given the complexity of the debt situation, the primary creditor held a supervisory interest in the estate's financial conduct going forward. He read the formal language from the document. He described it as a deed of contractual obligation. He said that during the period of outstanding debt, Wilhelmina Ellsworth's financial decisions regarding the estate were subject to the review and approval of the primary note holder. And Raymond Finley, who had not consulted Wilhelmina about this arrangement, who had apparently allowed Josiah Crane to construct it as a legal protection against Hatch's future maneuvers without telling her, stepped forward from the gallery wall and said to the assembled courthouse the words that exploded through the room like something thrown against a wall. "She answers to no one but me." Which was when Wilhelmina had stepped toward him with her face burning and her voice controlled and said, "I beg your pardon." In the chaos of the gallery's reaction and the gavel's repeated demand for order, Raymond had looked at her with an expression that was not triumph or arrogance but something much more complicated than either, and he had said, quietly enough that only she could hear, "I can explain all of it. Outside." She had stood there for a moment in the eye of the courtroom storm, with Hatch and his attorney looking calculatingly satisfied to one side, Josiah looking apologetically toward the middle distance, and the gallery buzzing with the particular energy of a piece of gossip that would be fully circulated before sunset. She had turned back to Raymond. "Outside," she agreed, and her voice was very cold. They stood on the covered steps of the Sweetwater County Courthouse in the hammering July heat, and Wilhelmina crossed her arms and waited. It was the only legal mechanism that prevented Hatch from filing another petition immediately, Raymond said. If the court record shows the primary creditor has formal oversight of the estate's management, Hatch can't claim the estate is being mismanaged without directly challenging my oversight. It buys time. Real time, enough to get the debt substantially reduced before he tries again. You made a legal agreement about my conduct without my knowledge, Wilhelmina said. "I did," he said. "And I am sorry for that. Josiah and I worked it out the night before the hearing, and I should have told you. That was wrong." She looked at him. He did not attempt to soften it or explain it further. He simply held her gaze and accepted the assessment. "What does it actually require of me?" she asked. "On paper, you document significant financial decisions about the estate with my signature as co-approver. In reality, it means we work together on the estate's management until the debt is resolved. If you tell me to leave your land and never come back the day the last dollar is paid, I will do exactly that." The heat was very present. A horse across the street shook flies from its neck. The sounds of Sweetwater conducting its daily business moved around them like water around a stone. "You said she answers to no one but me," Wilhelmina said. "That is a very significant statement to make publicly about another person." "It was more dramatic than I intended," he said. She looked at him for a long moment and felt the truth of that. She thought about the fence line and the general store and the kitchen table and the porch steps and all the Tuesday and Wednesday afternoons of the past 4 months, and she thought about the way he had said, "Don't say it yet. Let's get through the courthouse first." "What happens after the courthouse?" she asked. Something moved in his expression. Something that was not the careful, measured manner of Raymond Finley conducting business, but the underlying reality of Raymond Finley being completely present and barely contained. "Whatever you decide," he said, "but I want to be honest with you about what I would like to happen." "Be honest then," she said. "I would like to spend the next year working on your land with you, and not only because of the debt. I would like to continue the conversation we have been having since March, all of it, and I would like to see where it goes." He paused. "And I would like to have the chance to earn your trust properly, not because a court document says I have oversight, but because you decide I deserve it." Wilhelmina stood very still. The sun was brutal and honest and entirely without mercy, and it illuminated everything in the way that high summer in New Mexico does, showing all the details. "You have," she said, "a very long way to go on that last point." "I know it," he said. "But I am willing to see where the conversation goes," she said. He almost smiled. It was the smallest possible version of it, just a shift at the corner of his mouth. But it was real and unguarded, and it did something decisive and probably irreversible to the architecture of Wilhelmina Ellsworth's well-maintained emotional defenses. She walked back down the courthouse steps to her buckboard, climbed up with composure, and drove back to the homestead without looking back, though she was aware for the full duration of the drive that she was smiling in a way she couldn't seem to stop. The arrangement that followed was nothing like what either of them had said in their more cautious moments. Wilhelmina had expected it to be uncomfortable, this formal supervisory presence of Raymond Finley in the management of the Ellsworth estate. She had expected tension and negotiation, and the constant reminder of the power differential the court document technically created. Instead it was, from the very first working week, remarkably natural. He came on Wednesdays and Saturdays, which he had suggested and she had agreed to. He brought two of his hired hands on the Saturdays for larger physical work, and he came alone on Wednesdays. They walked the property, they assessed what needed doing, they discussed the finances with an honesty that she found bracing, and he seemed to find genuinely enjoyable. He did not talk down to her. He did not make decisions without asking her view. The document said he had oversight, but in practice what it looked like was a partnership between two people who respected each other's thinking. He taught her things she did not know. How to read the drainage patterns of the eastern quarter and use them to plan planting. How to assess the health of a fence line not just visually, but by walking it and listening for the particular sounds wire makes when it's beginning to fail. How to negotiate with the cattle buyers who came through Sweetwater in August, when the summer sales were happening, by knowing not just what your cattle were worth but what the buyer needed them to be worth on his end. She taught him things too. He had not expected this, she could tell, though he adapted to it with grace. She had an analytical mind shaped by 3 years of teaching, and before that by a childhood spent reading everything she could get her hands on in a territory where books were scarce, which had taught her to extract maximum understanding from minimum material. She read the territorial land reports that came out of Santa Fe and identified 3 things in the county's water rights documentation that Raymond's attorney had apparently missed. She organized the estate's financial records with a precision that Josiah Crane, when he reviewed them, said was the best-kept account book he had seen in Sweetwater County in 10 years. She argued with Raymond about the best use of the eastern quarter and won the argument through patient accumulation of evidence, and he had listened to her win it without making her feel that he was allowing her to win, which was its own form of respect. The conversations continued. They continued past business and into everything else. The territory's politics, which they agreed on in some respects and disagreed on sharply in others. The question of what New Mexico needed to become a proper state, which Raymond cared about more than he had initially indicated. The injustice of how the Pueblo and Navajo communities were being managed by the federal government in the territory, which neither of them had the power to change, but which Raymond spoke about with an anger that Wilhelmina had not expected from a man who had benefited from the frontier's expansion, and which she found she shared, having seen enough of what the territorial administration's policies actually produced when she was teaching in Santa Fe. They talked about her father sometimes, carefully and in small amounts, the way you approach something that has jagged edges. Raymond had known Clyde Ellsworth not well but adequately. He had loaned him the money because Clyde had asked directly and with an unusual honesty about his own unreliability, which Raymond had found more compelling than confidence would have been. He said Clyde had been a man who understood his own flaws and simply could not fix them, which was perhaps the saddest kind. Wilhelmina had thought about that for a long time after he said it. In August, Cornelius Hatch made his next move. He approached 2 of the 4 remaining small creditors and purchased their notes, which meant he now held $500 of Wilhelmina's total debt. He could not use this to force foreclosure on the primary security, but he filed a supplementary petition requesting that the court review Raymond's oversight arrangement on the grounds that it represented a conflict of interest, since the primary creditor was simultaneously the supervisory authority over the debtor's financial decisions. It was, Wilhelmina had to admit, clever. Dawson had constructed it neatly. The argument was that Raymond could theoretically suppress the estate's financial progress to keep the debt outstanding indefinitely, which served his interest as a man with supervisory power over a valuable piece of land. She had brought the petition to Raymond on a Wednesday, the day after she received it, and they had sat at her kitchen table, the table that had been her father's and before that had come west with her mother who had died when Wilhelmina was 9, and she had watched him read it. He read it without expression. When he finished, he set it down and looked at her. "He's trying to use us against each other," he said. "He's trying to use the legal structure you built against you," she said. "He's arguing that your oversight corrupts the process." "Does it?" Raymond asked. The question landed in the room with more weight than its 4 words suggested. She understood immediately what he was actually asking, not whether the legal arrangement was corrupt, but whether her judgment of him had been compromised by the 4 months they had spent working together, by the Wednesday afternoons and the fence lines and the porch steps and all the accumulated substance of knowing a person closely. "No," she said, "because your oversight has been in practice no oversight at all. You have managed this arrangement as a partnership, not as control. The record will show that." "The record will show what it shows," he said quietly, "but what I'm asking is what you know." She looked at him across her father's table in the morning light of an August day and understood that they had arrived at the moment she had been either approaching or avoiding for 4 months depending on the particular hour. "I know," she said carefully, "that you have given me no reason to doubt you. That is not a small thing, Raymond. I have had many reasons in my life to doubt people, and I have been right to doubt them. You have been consistent and honest and fair in a situation where you held considerable power to be otherwise. That should be the minimum standard," he said. "It should be," she agreed. "It is not always." They looked at each other across the table. The morning light moved as a cloud passed over the sun and returned. Outside, one of her horses shifted weight in the corral. "What does Hatch's petition require us to do?" Raymond asked, and she was grateful to him for the practical redirect because the other conversation needed more time and more readiness than she currently had. "Josiah says we need to demonstrate to the court that the financial management of the estate is genuinely independent. That means documented decisions made by me without requiring your signature." "We can revise the arrangement," Raymond said immediately. "Remove the co-approval requirement. You make your financial decisions independently, and I simply receive copies of the documentation. It preserves the oversight structure on paper while demonstrating in practice that you're managing independently. Hatch will argue that receiving copies is effectively the same as approval. Not if you make a decision I disagree with and the documentation shows it." She looked at him. "You want me to make a decision you disagree with?" "I want you to make the decision about the Eastern Quarter," he said. "The one we argued about in June. You want to put in a kitchen garden and sell the produce at the Sweetwater market. I thought the time investment wasn't worth the return. Make the decision. Document it. I'll note my disagreement in the record." She was quiet for a moment. "That's a real disagreement. You genuinely think the kitchen garden is poor use of the quarter?" "I do," he said, "but I might be wrong, and either way it proves the point. You would let the record show you were overruled by the debtor whose decisions you are supposedly supervising." "I would let the record show the truth," he said. "She planted the kitchen garden in the Eastern Quarter in the first week of September." Raymond noted his disagreement in the co-management record, formally and without rancor. Josiah filed it with the court. When Hatch's petition was heard in mid-September, Dawson attempted to argue conflict of interest and Josiah presented the record of the disagreement, and Judge Prentice dismissed the supplementary petition with a brief observation that the arrangement appeared to be functioning as a genuine financial management partnership rather than a mechanism of control. Hatch had left the courthouse with his patient smile undisturbed and Dawson closed behind him, and Wilhelmina had stood on the steps again in the September heat and felt something very close to joy. Raymond stood beside her. "You should know," she said, "that I may have been wrong about the kitchen garden." "You may have been," he agreed. "If I was, I will admit it directly and without excessive ceremony." "I know you will," he said. She turned to look at him and found him already looking at her, and the September sun was behind him and the world was very bright and she was done with the waiting. "I would like to invite you to dinner," she said. "Not about the estate, not about the debt, just dinner." He was very still for a moment, then, "Saturday." "Saturday," she confirmed. The kitchen garden, as it turned out, produced abundantly. By October, the eastern quarter was yielding squash, beans, and enough tomatoes that Wilhelmina had sold 3 crates at the Sweetwater market and netted $14, which she applied directly to the primary note. Raymond, when she told him, had the grace to say he had been wrong without excessive ceremony of his own. The Saturday dinners became a rhythm. She cooked, which she was better at than he was, and he brought things from the Broken Spur, good cuts of beef and occasionally vegetables from his own garden that he apparently kept and had not mentioned. They ate at the table that had been her father's and talked until the candles burned low. She learned things about him that the 4 months of Wednesday and Saturday working visits had not revealed, because those conversations had been adjacent to purpose, and these were not. She learned that he had come west from Missouri at 22 with 2 horses, $100, and no particular plan beyond the general ambition to own land and run it well. That he had spent 3 years working other men's ranches before he had saved enough to stake himself. That he had named the Broken Spur not for any story, but because the previous owner had left a broken spur hanging in the barn, and he had kept it as a reminder that things break and you continue anyway. She told him about her mother, which she rarely told anyone. Her mother had been a woman of considerable intelligence and considerable energy, who had married Clyde Ellsworth at 19 because he was handsome and full of plans, and who had spent the next decade discovering that plans and execution were not the same thing, and loving him anyway, and who had died of scarlet fever when Wilhelmina was 9 in a way that had left Wilhelmina with a very clear and somewhat reluctant understanding that love was not a protection against the world's indifference. "You have been managing that knowledge your whole life," Raymond said. "I have," she said. "It makes a person careful." "It made you careful and it made you capable," he said. "That is not a small inheritance." She had looked at him across the table with the candle between them and felt something settle in her, some long-held tension that she had been carrying so long she had stopped noticing its weight, and she said, "I think I am not going to be careful about you." He reached across the table and covered her hand with his. They sat like that for a moment in the quiet of the house, with the October wind moving outside and the candle steady between them. And it was the simplest possible thing, and it was everything. In November, Cornelius Hatch made his final move. He had been quiet since September's dismissal, which Wilhelmina had taken not as retreat but as patience. Hatch was the kind of man who waited for the right pressure point. He found it when he discovered, through what channel Wilhelmina never entirely determined, that Raymond's oversight arrangement with the Ellsworth estate was creating difficulty for Raymond's relationship with the Cattlemen's Association of Sweetwater County. The Cattlemen's Association was the territory's primary livestock organization, responsible for coordinating the cattle drives, establishing seasonal prices, and maintaining the kind of collective influence that made individual ranchers' positions in the market viable. Raymond was a member in good standing. He was, in fact, on the association's board. Hatch, who had recently joined the association through his own land holdings, began circulating among the members the suggestion that Raymond's personal entanglement with a debtor's estate raised questions about his judgment and impartiality. It was not a legal maneuver this time. It was a social one. And social maneuvering in a territory where you're standing in the Cattlemen's Association directly affected your ability to sell your beef at fair prices was not trivial. Hatch was attacking Raymond's livelihood, using Raymond's involvement with Wilhelmina as the weapon. Raymond told her about it on a Wednesday in November, sitting at her kitchen table with the autumn cold coming under the door and a fire in the hearth, and his voice was entirely level when he described it. She felt something she had not expected to feel, fury on his behalf, protective, focused fury directed at a man who was using decency as a vulnerability. "He is doing this because you helped me," she said. "He's doing it because he has run out of legal options and this is what remains," Raymond said. He knows I won't step back from my position on the estate to protect my association standing. How do you know that? Because if I would, I wouldn't be the kind of man worth attacking, he said simply. She stood up from the table and went to the window and stood looking out at the November land, brown and clean and hers, and thought about the texture of being in a position where someone was being harmed because of their connection to you. It was not a feeling she had encountered before in quite this configuration, because the people in her life had not previously chosen to be harmed on her behalf. It was uncomfortable in a way that was entirely distinct from being harmed yourself. "I want to address the Cattlemen's Association," she said. Raymond said nothing. "I am the debtor of record. I am the estate holder. I can speak to the nature of the arrangement and what it has and has not involved in practice." She turned from the window. "I want to appear before them and speak directly." "Wilhelmina," he said. "I am not asking your permission," she said. "I am telling you what I intend to do." He looked at her for a long moment with something in his expression that was not objection but its close neighbor. Then he said, "The next association meeting is Thursday of next week." "Then I will be there Thursday of next week." The meeting was held at the Meridian Hotel's large dining room, which was cleared of tables and set with chairs for the 23 association members. Wilhelmina arrived with Josiah Crane, who had agreed to attend as her legal counsel, and whose presence gave the occasion the formal weight she intended it to have. She wore the dark blue wool dress again. Raymond was already present at the far end of the room, and he met her eyes when she entered with an expression she could now read clearly. It was pride, carefully restrained. The meeting's formal business was conducted first. Then Hatch, with the air of a man who had been waiting for the appropriate moment, raised his concern about the Raymond Finley situation in the manner of a concerned colleague rather than an agitator, which was a considerably more sophisticated approach and made it harder to challenge directly. Before anyone could respond, Wilhelmina rose. She did not have Josiah introduce her. She introduced herself. She said her name and the nature of her business in Sweetwater, and the status of the debt, and the specifics of the oversight arrangement in precise, unhurried language. She described every documented decision made under the arrangement and Raymond's recorded disagreements and her independent choices, and the outcome of each. She presented it as what it was, a financial management arrangement that had served the estate's improvement, and had done so through genuine collaboration rather than control. Then she said, and she said it directly to the room with the kind of clarity that comes from having nothing left to lose and no reason for anything less than the complete truth. "Mr. Finley's involvement with my estate has not affected his judgment or his impartiality. It has affected his schedule, his labor, and his patience, all of which he has given freely and in good faith. If this association considers that evidence of compromised judgment, I would respectfully suggest that what it actually demonstrates is the character of a man who honors his commitments even when it costs him something." The room was quiet. Then a man named Gus Pearson, who had been on the association board longer than anyone, and who was generally regarded as Sweetwater County's most reliable indication of collective opinion, said, "I don't see what the problem is, Hatch." And that was the end of Cornelius Hatch's influence in the Cattlemen's Association of Sweetwater County. He did not give up entirely. He came to the homestead one final time in December, his patience visibly diminished for the first time, and offered Wilhelmina $600 for the land. She told him the land was not for sale. He said he would find another way. She told him that if he pursued any further legal or social action against either herself or Raymond Finley, she would retain the sharpest attorney in Santa Fe, and they would examine every land acquisition he had made in Sweetwater County for the past 3 years with meticulous attention. She said this not as a threat but as a simple statement of what would happen. Hatch had looked at her with the patience gone from his face and something genuinely cold in its place. And then he had gotten into his clean buggy and driven back to town, and they did not hear from him in any significant way again. Wilhelmina stood on the porch and watched the buggy recede, and felt the particular satisfaction of a problem that has been definitively resolved rather than merely postponed. Raymond rode up 20 minutes later because she had sent Abe Garfield's boy with a message when Hatch arrived, and he swung down from his horse and came up the porch steps and looked at her. "It's done," she said. "Tell me," he said. She told him. He listened with his hat in his hands and his face open in the way it was when he was not performing anything at all. When she finished, he said, "You did that yourself." "I had considerable assistance over the past 9 months," she said. "You had a partner," he said. "You did it yourself." She looked at him standing on her porch in the December cold with the mountains behind him and the Ellsworth land stretching away on all sides. Her land she had decided she was keeping. And she thought about all the distance between March and December, all the fence lines and kitchen tables and courthouse steps. "Stay for dinner," she said. He stayed for dinner. He stayed and they ate by the fire and talked about everything that was not the debt or the estate or Cornelius Hatch, and the candles burned down, and neither of them moved to light more. In the firelight, Raymond looked at her in the particular way he had that made her feel seen in a way she had not been seen before, and she looked back with all the carefulness finally set aside. "I need to tell you something," he said. "Tell me," she said. "I have been in love with you since April," he said. "Somewhere between the fence line and the first time you walked into the Cattlemen's Association meeting. I have been managing it carefully because you needed someone managing it carefully and not putting more pressure on a situation that had sufficient pressure already." She sat with this for a moment, not because she was surprised by it, but because it deserved the respect of being received fully. "I know," she said. "I have not been as careful about it as I perhaps suggested I would be." "I know that too," he said, with a small, real smile. She reached across the space between their chairs and took his hand, and he turned it and held hers, and it was not the first time he had done that, but it was the first time with nothing provisional about it. "I love you," she said, because she was not a woman who managed important truths by implication when she could say them directly. He brought her hand up and pressed it briefly to his forehead, a gesture so unlike his usual measured manner that it undid something in her completely, and when he looked up his eyes were bright in the firelight. "Wilhelmina," he said, and her name in his voice was the whole conversation, all of it, everything they had been since March. Christmas in Sweetwater passed with the quiet of a frontier winter, cold and clear and full of the particular beauty of high desert country under frost. Wilhelmina and Raymond spent it with a kind of unspoken ease. That was not the ease of people who have run out of things to say, but the ease of people who have said enough of the difficult things, that the comfortable ones flow naturally. She had gone to the Broken Spur for Christmas Day, which she had offered to make dinner for, and she had done so in Raymond's kitchen, and discovered that his pantry was considerably better stocked than her own, and had told him so with the directness that had by now become her primary mode with him, and he had laughed, which was a sound she had not heard from him in full until recently, and which she found she had been waiting for without knowing it. His hired man Dolph and 2 of the other hands who had no family nearby were also there, and they ate at the long kitchen table and talked until the early evening, and afterward Wilhelmina and Raymond sat on the porch wrapped in coats with the cold air and the stars very clear and enormous above the desert, and she had thought, with the settled certainty of someone who has finally arrived at a place they did not know they were traveling toward, that she was not going back to Santa Fe. She had written to her superintendent in January to confirm it. She had given up her position, which she had held and valued for 3 years, without the regret she had half expected to feel. Sweetwater had a school that needed a teacher, as it happened, and the school board had been more than willing to make arrangements when she approached them in February. The kitchen garden in the eastern quarter had survived the winter under good mulching and was ready to be replanted in March, which would be exactly 1 year since she had arrived in Sweetwater with 2 trunks and a freshly devastating letter. The debt stood at $940 at the start of the new year. reduced by Wilhelmina's payments from the cattle sale, the kitchen garden, and 3 months of applying a portion of what she had saved in Santa Fe. Raymond had also quietly noted that he intended to revisit the original interest terms as a gesture toward the good faith with which the repayment had been conducted, a reduction that Josiah formalized in February and which brought the remaining principal to $860. It was still a significant amount, but it was finite. It had edges now, and she could see the far side of it. In the first week of April, 1 year almost exactly after Wilhelmina had driven herself out to the broken spur for the first time, Raymond arrived at the homestead on a Wednesday morning, not with his usual air of purposeful arrival, but with something different about him, a tension she did not associate with work. She was in the kitchen garden when she heard his horse, and she came around the side of the house to find him dismounting with his hat in his hand, which he did when the occasion was significant. "Wilhelmina," he said. "Raymond," she said, and waited. He came to where she stood with the spring earth soft under her boots and the mountains green with their late-season snow and the whole of the Ellsworth land quiet and alive around them. "I want to ask you something," he said. "Ask," she said. "I want to ask you to marry me," he said. "Not because of the debt, not because of the land arrangement, not because of anything Josiah has filed with the county court. Because you are the only person I have ever met who argues with me accurately, and because I have been happier in the past year than I have been at any other point in my life, and because I believe we would build something together that neither of us would build alone." The April wind moved through the scrub, and the horses moved in the corral, and Sweetwater County conducted itself in the middle distance. She took one step toward him and put her hand against his jaw, feeling the roughness of it and the warmth, and looked at him straight. "Yes," she said. He covered her hand with his, and they stood in the morning quiet of her land, their land, the land they were going to grow something on together, and there was nothing more required. They were married in June of 1884 in the Sweetwater Community Church, which was small and needed painting, and was full beyond its comfortable capacity. Josiah Crane was there. Abe Garfield and his family were there. Dolph and the Broken Spur Hands were there. The Cattlemen's Association members attended in force, which Gus Pearson said was the highest attendance he had seen at any social event in the county in 5 years. The school board members came. Half of Sweetwater came, which was fitting because the story of Raymond Finley and Wilhelmina Ellsworth and the courthouse debt had been the county's most discussed narrative for the better part of a year. Cornelius Hatch did not attend. He had, in the months following December's confrontation, quietly redirected his land acquisition interests to Doña Ana County to the south, where the railroad speculation had moved, and where his particular skill set found new application. Sweetwater did not miss him. Wilhelmina wore a cream dress that she had made herself over 4 weeks with help from the seamstress at the dry goods store. Raymond wore his good coat and a white shirt, and had polished his boots to a shine that was clearly the product of considerable effort. When she walked down the aisle toward him, and he looked at her with the expression that she had first seen across a kitchen table, and had been learning the full vocabulary of ever since, she felt the entirety of the past 15 months settle around her like something solid and hers. The ceremony was conducted by the county pastor, and attended by the noise of a full church, and the light coming through the 2 small windows, and the whole particular realness of it. When it was done, and they were standing outside in the June sun, with congratulations arriving from every direction at once, Raymond put his hand in the small of her back, and said quietly into the vicinity of her ear, "I think we have established beyond reasonable legal doubt that you answer to no one but yourself." She turned and looked at him and laughed, a full and genuine laugh that she had also been discovering over the past months in correlation with his presence. "Except that you will always have the relevant documents," she said. "The relevant documents are in Josiah's keeping," he said, "and there is one specific one I intend to have amended immediately." She looked at him. "The debt," he said. She understood what he meant a moment later. They were married now. The debt, which had been a legal obligation between two separate parties, had a different character in the context of a household. She had thought about this and had her own position. "Absolutely not," she said. He looked surprised, which was not an expression she often produced on him. "I will pay the remaining $860, she said. "Not quickly and not before the household has sufficient reserve, but I will pay it. The debt is mine. I inherited it and I am resolving it. That is not a statement about us. It is a statement about me." He held her gaze for a moment and then nodded slowly. "The kitchen garden had a good first year," she added. "The second year will be better." He smiled, the full real one, and said, "You're extraordinary." "I know it," she said, using his phrase, and felt his hand tighten slightly at her back. They went home to the homestead that evening, which they had agreed would be their primary residence, while the Broken Spur operations continued under Dolph's capable daily management. And Raymond had carried her across the threshold with the formal tradition of it, and she had told him the custom dated to an ancient Roman practice about preventing new brides from tripping on the threshold, which was the kind of information she produced in moments of feeling too much emotion to address it directly. And he had laughed and set her down inside and kissed her in the hallway of her father's house, her house, their house, with the evening light coming through the windows and the smell of the land coming through the open door. The first year of their marriage was a year of building. They expanded the kitchen garden in the spring. They acquired 6 additional cattle in the fall through a purchase Raymond negotiated at the Cattlemen's Association Drive. Wilhelmina taught at the Sweetwater school from September through May, and found in it the same satisfaction she had found in Santa Fe, heightened by the fact that she was teaching in her own community now, to children whose families she knew, and whose progress she could follow not only through the school year, but through the years afterward. Raymond learned, over the course of the year, that being married to Wilhelmina involved a level of intellectual engagement he had not fully anticipated and found he could not do without. She challenged his thinking daily. She disagreed with him with precision and fairness, and she was right often enough that he had developed a genuine respect for her disagreement that went beyond affection into something closer to reliance. He told her once that she had improved his judgment significantly since March of 1883, and she had told him that was a very romantic thing to say, and they had both laughed. By the end of their first married year, the debt stood at $640. In the spring of 1885, Wilhelmina told Raymond she was expecting their first child. He was in the barn when she found him, attending to a horse that had thrown a shoe, and he was on one knee with the horse's hoof in his lap, and he looked up at her when she came in and read her face before she said a word. He set the hoof down and stood up, and she watched something happen in his expression that was unlike anything she had seen from him before, a kind of unguarded, immediate joy that moved through his whole person. He crossed to her and took her face in his hands very carefully and looked at her. "Are you all right?" he asked first. "I am very well," she said. "I have been telling you I am capable for 2 years. You are the most capable person I know," he said. "I am asking if you are well because I love you, and it's the question that comes first." She covered his hands with hers. "I am well. We are well." He pressed his forehead to hers, and they stood in the barn in the spring morning with the horses moving quietly around them. Their son was born in November of 1885. They named him James Clyde Finley, James for Raymond's grandfather who had built the Missouri farm where Raymond grew up, and Clyde for Wilhelmina's father, because, whatever his failings, he had given her the land and the land had given her everything else. James was a loud and opinionated infant who seemed to have inherited both parents' tendencies toward direct communication, and who grew into a healthy, sturdy boy with Raymond's eyes and Wilhelmina's expression, when she had decided something was wrong and intended to say so. The debt was cleared in the spring of 1886, 2 years and 9 months after the courthouse hearing that had cracked a gavel's edge and launched something neither of them had planned. Wilhelmina brought the final payment to Josiah Crane on a Tuesday morning with James in her arms, and Josiah stamped the note paid and made a notation in the county record with his usual precision and handed her the original document. She brought it home and showed it to Raymond that evening after dinner, smoothed out on the table between them with James asleep in the next room and the spring night coming through the open window. He looked at it and then looked at her. "Well," he said. "Well," she said. "You did it," he said. "We did it," she said. "You kept Hatch from taking it. I paid the debt. It was collaborative." He picked up the note and folded it carefully and handed it back to her. "Yours to keep." She took it. She thought about putting it somewhere safe and private, a drawer or a box, the way you put the evidence of something difficult and finished. Instead, she took it to the hearth and held one corner to the fire and watched it catch and burn to nothing. And she stood watching until the last of it was ash. When she turned back, Raymond was watching her with the full, unguarded expression she still found after 3 years, capable of undoing her in the best possible way. "I love you," she said. "I love you," he said. Life in Sweetwater continued its expansion. The railroad came through, as the speculators had suspected it would, but the route the surveyors finally ran went 2 miles south of the Ellsworth property, which meant the land had not the railroad windfall Hatch had imagined, but it had something more durable: good soil and good water rights, and a woman who understood how to use both. Wilhelmina expanded the kitchen garden into a productive market operation over the next 4 years. She hired 2 women from town to help with the harvest seasons and was meticulous about paying them fairly, which was not universal practice, and which she did not particularly care whether anyone approved of. She remained at the Sweetwater School and became its principal in 1888 when the previous principal retired, which meant she was both running a farming operation and managing a school, a combination that required the kind of organizational capacity she possessed in full. Raymond's broken spur expanded steadily, and with the same methodical quality that had always characterized it. He and Dolph built a second bunkhouse in 1887 and added 20 head of cattle in 1888. He was elected to the board of the Cattlemen's Association as its recording secretary in 1886, a position he held for many years, and his assessments of the territory's land and water policies became genuinely influential in Sweetwater County's engagement with the territorial government in Santa Fe. He never stopped coming to the homestead on Wednesdays, though the nature of the visit had changed from its original function. Wednesday was simply the day he made the Ellsworth property his primary work location, which had a practical logic to it, given that they were managing both operations, and the homestead's kitchen garden required his attention in the growth seasons. Wilhelmina occasionally pointed out that the official reason for Wednesday visits had been dissolved along with the court arrangement years ago, and Raymond occasionally pointed out that he had never particularly needed official reasons for things he intended to do. Their daughter arrived in the summer of 1888. They named her Clara, for no particular reason except that it suited her from the first moment, and Clara was from the beginning an entirely different temperament than James, quieter and more watchful, with a habit of absorbing everything around her and processing it at a speed that her parents recognized as familiar from different angles. James and Clara grew up on the Ellsworth homestead and the Broken Spur, moving between the 2 properties with the ease of children who understand that their world is larger than one location. They grew up knowing the land and the cattle and the school and the town. They grew up hearing their parents argue about interesting things and reach conclusions together. They grew up knowing that their mother had paid a debt she had not created and kept a piece of land that no one had thought she could keep, and that their father had stood in a courthouse and made an impossible statement that had turned out to be entirely true. In the fall of 1890, Wilhelmina and Raymond sat on the porch of the homestead in the early evening with the children inside, and the first cool of the autumn coming off the mountains and the land spread before them in the late golden light. Raymond had a cup of coffee. Wilhelmina had a book she was not reading. They had been sitting in a comfortable silence for some time. "Do you know what I think about?" she said. "When I think about the courthouse." "Tell me," he said. "I think about how frightened I was," she said. "I was so frightened that morning. I had the homestead and the debt and Hatch maneuvering behind everything, and I had you, and I did not know yet that I had you. And then you said that thing. I handled that badly," he said, for perhaps the third or fourth time in 7 years. "You handled it terribly," she agreed. "It was the least subtle thing I had ever heard, and I was so angry. I know. But what I remember now, apart from the anger," she said, "is that underneath the anger I felt something else, something that was not anger at all." She paused. "I felt protected for the first time in a very long time. I felt like someone had put themselves between me and the worst possibility and meant it." He was quiet for a moment. "I did mean it." "I know you did," she said. "I knew it then too, somewhere underneath the fury. I just needed time to let the knowing catch up." He reached over and took her hand without looking away from the horizon. "We have built something good here," she said. "We have," he agreed. "My father would have been proud," she said. "I think. He might also have tried to borrow money from you again." Raymond made a sound that was somewhere between a laugh and a sigh. "I would have given it to him." "I know you would have," she said. "That is the thing about you, Raymond. You are fundamentally generous in the direction of people who need it." "You needed considerably more than a loan," he said. "I needed a partner," she said. "I got one." The evening settled around them. Somewhere inside the house James said something to Clara, and Clara responded with the particular tone that meant she had just corrected him about something, which happened with a frequency that suggested the natural order of their household. Raymond squeezed her hand and she squeezed back, and they sat together on the porch of the land that was theirs now in every sense, watching the last of the light go gold and then amber and then the soft blue of a New Mexico dusk. And the mountains held their shapes against the darkening sky, and the land was quiet and good and fully, finally, theirs. There would be more to come. A third child, a boy they would name Eli, born in 1892 with Raymond's jaw and his grandmother Clara's name already waiting as a possible choice before they knew he would arrive so decisively as himself. The railroad that came 2 miles south would eventually bring more families to Sweetwater, and more students to Wilhelmina's school, and more buyers to the Cattlemen's Association Drive. The territory would become a state. Not yet, but the conversations were beginning, and Raymond would have things to say about it in venues that mattered. The Ellsworth homestead and the Broken Spur Ranch would eventually be managed as a single operation by their children, and the land that Clyde Ellsworth had struggled to maintain and Cornelius Hatch had tried to take would produce, over decades, a life so full and so specifically rooted in the work of two people who had chosen each other across a courthouse floor that it would seem, looking back, as though it had always been inevitable. But that was still ahead. In the fall of 1890, on the porch of the homestead in the last light, Raymond and Wilhelmina sat together and were present in the particular fullness of people who have earned what they have and know it. "I should see to the horses," Raymond said eventually, not moving. "You should," Wilhelmina agreed, not releasing his hand. They sat a while longer. The stars came out over New Mexico, one at a time and then all at once, the way truth arrives, and the night was clear and endless above them, and the land was theirs and they were each other's, and the debt that had begun everything was ash in a hearth 3 years gone, and what remained was what they had built on its foundation, solid and warm and entirely enough.